There are things a man can survive losing: a job, a house, a friendship that slowly fades. But when the person you built your life beside decides, quietly and without ceremony, that you are simply not enough, that kind of loss has a particular weight to it. It settles in the chest and stays. Harlow Beecham had spent 22 years learning how to be enough. He'd learned it in the early mornings when he drove 2 hours each way to a job site in Sudbury, while his wife, Vivian, slept in. He'd learned it in the evenings when he came home smelling of sawdust and concrete, and she wrinkled her nose just slightly. Not enough to be rude, just enough to be noticed. He'd learned it in the way she stopped reaching for his hand in public, the way she began referring to him at dinner parties as "my husband the contractor," the word contractor sitting in her mouth like something slightly disappointing. Psychologists call this kind of slow erosion relational devaluation, the gradual process by which a partner begins to communicate, through tone and omission, and the particular way they don't look at you, that your worth is diminishing in their eyes. It rarely announces itself. It arrives incrementally, the way a house settles, a creak here, a crack there, until one day you realize the foundation has been shifting for years. Harlow didn't have a psychology degree. He had a Red Seal certification, a firm handshake, and a company he'd built from the ground up over 17 years. Beecham Structural had started as one man and a used Silverado. By the time he was 43, it employed 64 people across 3 provinces and had just been awarded a federal contract to oversee the structural rehabilitation of 6 heritage bridges along the St. Lawrence corridor. 64 families, 64 people who packed lunches and drove to job sites and put their kids to bed at night because Harlow Beecham had shown up every single time, without fanfare. Vivian didn't know about the federal contract. She knew about the truck, the newer one, a black F-350 he kept meticulously clean, and she knew about the house, a restored Victorian in the Glebe in Ottawa that they'd bought 12 years ago and that she'd since renovated twice, each time adding something that cost more and looked less like anything Harlow would have chosen. She knew that he worked long hours and that he didn't talk much at parties and that he had the kind of hands that told you exactly what kind of life he'd lived. What she had decided at some point Harlow couldn't pinpoint exactly was that all of this added up to something less than what she'd imagined her life would be. Her name, full and formal as it had been introduced at the law firm's charity gala where they'd met, was Vivian Lacroix Beecham. She kept both names, hyphenated. She worked in corporate communications for a national law firm. She was good at her job in the way that certain people are good at projecting confidence, efficiently, persuasively, and with very little visible seam. She had a talent for rooms. She could walk into a gathering of strangers and within 20 minutes have identified the most important person there and positioned herself pleasantly in their orbit. Harlow had admired this quality once. Lately, he found it harder to remember why. The Foundation Gala was an annual event organized by the Ottawa Heritage Preservation Foundation. The kind of evening that required black tie, a donation at the door that made you pause, and a certain fluency in the language of institutional philanthropy. Harlow's company had been a mid-tier donor for 4 years. This year, following the announcement of the St. Lawrence contract, the foundation had moved Beecham Structural to the lead sponsorship table. Harlow had been informed of this by letter 3 weeks prior. He'd set the letter on his kitchen counter, where it sat under a fruit bowl for 2 days before Vivian noticed it. She did not react the way he expected. "You know," she said, setting the letter down without quite meeting his eyes, "I've been thinking. You're always so exhausted at these things. You end up standing near the bar, not really talking to anyone. Maybe it would be better if I took Mathieu this year. He's been helping me with the Montredon account anyway, and he actually enjoys that kind of evening." Mathieu Arnaud was Vivian's junior colleague at the firm. He was 31, fluent in French and English, and the particular social dialect of people who had attended the right schools. He wore fitted blazers, and had the posture of someone who had never spent a day bending over a trench in February. Harlow had met him twice at firm functions. He'd been perfectly polite. He'd also looked at Viviane the way certain men look at women who are not their own, not aggressively, but with a kind of careful attention that registered and was meant to register. Harlow said nothing for a moment. "I'm the lead sponsor," he said finally. "My name is on the table." "I know that," Viviane said. "I just thought it might be less stressful for you." What she had offered as consideration was, in the language of relational psychology, something closer to minimization, the act of framing a dismissal as a kindness, so that the person being dismissed is also implicitly invited to accept it graciously, to agree that they are indeed too small for the room they are being asked to leave. Harlow recognized it in the moment, though he wouldn't have called it by that name. He recognized it the way you recognize the sound a beam makes before it gives, a particular quality of stress that an experienced builder learns to read, not with alarm, but with a cold, quiet certainty. "Do what you like," he said. What Viviane heard in that sentence was compliance. What Harlow meant was something else entirely. The week before the gala, Harlow drove to Toronto. He told Viviane he had a site inspection in Mississauga. He did have a site inspection in Mississauga. He also had an appointment, which he mentioned to no one, at a tailor shop on King Street West, run by a man named Alphonse, who had been making clothes for Harlow's father before Harlow was born. Alphonse Deschaines was 72 years old and did not particularly care about trends. What he cared about was the relationship between a man's body and the fabric that covered it, the way a suit could serve as a kind of architecture. A designed system meant to bear weight and convey intention simultaneously. He'd made Harlow a suit for his father's funeral 12 years ago, and another for the ribbon cutting at the Beecham structural head office. Both times, Alphonse had asked the same question before picking up his chalk. "What is this occasion for?" Harlow sat in the low chair beside the fitting platform and thought about how to answer. "Walking into a room," he said. Alphonse looked at him over his glasses for a long moment. "And what do you want the room to know when you walk in?" "That I was here," Harlow said, "and that I didn't need anyone to bring me." Alphonse nodded slowly, as though this were a completely reasonable technical specification, and reached for his measuring tape. What emerged, over the course of 2 fittings that week, was a charcoal 3-piece with a subtle window pane grid and a waistcoat cut slim enough to suggest precision without performing it. Alphonse also produced, from somewhere in the back of his workroom, a long structured coat in deep navy wool. Not a cape in any theatrical sense, but something with a similar presence, a coat that moved with intention. He paired it with a gold lapel pin in the shape of a compass, a nod, Alphonse said, to people who know where they're going. Harlow stood in front of the mirror on the second fitting and looked at himself for a long time. He was 43. He had gray at his temples that his barber had been offering to fix for 2 years. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked with them. None of that had changed. What the suit did was not hide any of it. It framed it. "You look," Alphonse said from behind him, "like someone with a plan." Harlow smiled, the slow, private kind. "Good," he said. He arrived at the Chateau Laurier alone, which had been the plan from the moment Viviane made hers. He did not tell her he was going. He did not tell anyone. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Pauline, who had worked for him for 9 years, had RSVP'd for him personally 3 weeks prior at Harlow's instruction, without updating the household calendar. The chateau's ballroom was arranged as it always was for the foundation gala. Round tables with ivory linens, low centerpieces that didn't block sight lines, the kind of lighting that costs money to look effortless. The lead sponsor table was positioned nearest the podium, a fact that Harlow noticed as he handed his coat, the navy coat, which he had decided at the last moment meant to wear over the suit rather than check it, to the coat attendant. He kept the compass pin. He did not wear sunglasses. He did not carry a cane. He was not performing anything. He was simply arriving, in a room where his name was on the table, on his own terms, in the clothes of a man who had made a decision. What happened in the following 30 seconds was something that Harlow would not have been able to predict and would later replay more times than he admitted. He walked in. The room, in the general and unprogrammed way that rooms sometimes do, shifted slightly. Not theatrically, not like a film, the way air changes when a door opens. A few faces turned. A woman at the third table, who had been mid-sentence, paused, losing the thread. A board member from the foundation, a man named Conrad, who Harlow had met twice and who ran a large infrastructure firm, made brief eye contact and nodded, the slow, deliberate kind of nod one extends to a peer. Harlow found his table. He sat down. He ordered still water and unfolded his napkin and looked at the program. He did not look for Vivienne. She found him. He became aware of her presence the way you become aware of weather. A change in the quality of stillness at the table. He looked up. Vivienne had gone pale in the particular way that registered shock without allowing it to fully surface. A kind of managed startlement, the face doing its best to stay composed while the internal calculation ran visibly beneath. Mathieu was behind her slightly, a half step back in the position of someone who has just realized the geography of the room does not match the map they were given. "Harlow," Vivienne said. Her voice was professionally controlled. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know," Harlow said. There was a pause that lasted about 4 seconds. In interpersonal dynamics, 4 seconds of unstructured silence in a social context is a remarkably long time. It is long enough for meaning to accumulate, for power to redistribute. It is long enough for a man who has been called boring, quietly and over many years, to say nothing at all and be heard clearly. "You're at the lead table," Vivienne said. It came out almost as a question. "I am," Harlow said. "It has my name on it." He said it without particular edge, not cruelly. Simply as a statement of fact, in the way a builder might read a measurement off a level. Here is what is true. Here is what the instrument shows. Mathieu, to his credit, excused himself gracefully to find the bar. Vivienne sat down at a different table, a table toward the back, a table without a name on it, the kind allocated to guests who arrive with someone else's invitation. What Harlow had not told Vivienne, because she had never asked, was the detail he had been carrying for 11 months. Beecham Structural, 3 years ago, had taken on a partner, a financial services company called Meridian Capital that had offered significant investment in exchange for a minority stake. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable arrangement. 18 months later, Meridian's parent company had been absorbed in an acquisition that went badly, and the resulting financial exposure had worked its way, slowly and lethally, through every subsidiary. By late last year, Harlow had received notice that Meridian's stake in Beecham Structural was being called in to service debt, a process that, if it ran its course, would have triggered a forced sale of the company's core assets. 64 people, 64 families. Harlow had spent 7 months in quiet negotiation with a consortium of Canadian lenders, restructuring the agreement, buying back Meridian's stake personally, reorganizing the company's equity in a way that cost him, specifically and significantly, his personal savings, a significant portion of the equity he'd built in the house in the glebe, and 11 months of sleeping 4 hours a night. He had done this without involving Vivienne, partly because the legal advice was to keep the personal and corporate matters separate, and partly because, if he was honest with himself, he already knew what her reaction would be. Not supportive, not interested, somewhere between anxious and dismissive, and ultimately focused on what it meant for the renovation she'd been planning. He had made the decision alone. He had solved it alone. And on the night that the federal contract letter arrived, the letter that confirmed not only that the company had survived, but that it had been recognized at a national level, he had stood in his kitchen and felt something he could not quite name. Not triumph, something quieter, something that felt like proof. The foundation, it turned out, had done its research. The lead sponsorship recognition was no accident. Conrad, at the podium midway through the evening, spoke about Beecham Structural's contribution to Canadian heritage infrastructure and, unexpectedly, and in terms that made Harlow sit very still in his chair, mentioned the company's recent refinancing as an example of the kind of long-term stewardship that anchored communities. He did not mention the specifics. He did not need to. The people in the room who understood finance understood what had been said. At the table toward the back, Viviane sat with a fixed expression that Harlow, glancing briefly in her direction, recognized as the face she wore when a calculation had come out wrong. He did not feel satisfaction in the way he had expected. What he felt was more like the structural sensation of a beam finally bearing the load it was designed for. A settling into function, a rightness without performance. The evening concluded with the kind of unhurried graciousness that follows a formal dinner that has gone well. Harlow spoke to Conrad at length about the Bridge Corridor project. He was introduced to a woman named Ilse, who ran a heritage foundation in Vancouver and who had the brisk, engaged energy of someone who did not waste time. He accepted a glass of wine from a passing server and stood near the tall windows that overlooked the canal, watching the lights on the water. He did not drink the wine quickly. He had nowhere to be. Viviane found him again near the end of the evening, this time without Mathieu, who had apparently left early. She stood beside him for a moment in silence, looking at the water. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I know," he said. "About the company, about Meridian, all of it. I know you didn't." She was quiet again. Out on the canal, a light moved slowly, a late boat, or maybe just the reflection of something overhead, shifting with the water. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Harlow turned the question over with genuine care, the way he would turn over a structural problem, not to assign blame, but to understand where the load had been distributed incorrectly. "I don't think you would have helped," he said finally. "I think you would have been afraid, and I couldn't afford to manage your fear and solve the problem at the same time." It was not a cruel thing to say. It was an honest one. There is a difference, though it sometimes requires a great deal of time to see it clearly. Viviane did not respond immediately. When she did, what she said was, "I called you boring. You did," Harlow said. "I was wrong." "You were," he said. "But I think what you meant was that I wasn't exciting in the ways that were visible to you. And that's a different problem. One I don't think either of us can solve." This, psychologically speaking, is what researchers who study marital dissolution call a clarity moment, not a dramatic confrontation, not an explosion of accumulated grievance, but a still point at which two people simultaneously recognize that the relationship has arrived somewhere neither of them had intended, and that the distance between them is not the kind that can be closed by a conversation at a gala. Viviane looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, a small, contained gesture, the nod of someone absorbing information they cannot argue with, and walked away. Harlow finished his water. He straightened his lapel. He picked up the compass pin, which had worked slightly loose, and pressed it back into place. He stayed another 40 minutes, talking to Conrad and Ilse about a new heritage conservation initiative in Nova Scotia, and feeling, in the background of the conversation, a low and continuous sense of lightness. The kind that comes not from winning something, but from no longer carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place. The divorce was, in the practical sense, uncomplicated. They had a prenuptial agreement that Viviane had originally insisted upon, a fact that Harlow had always privately found somewhat clarifying. The house went into a structured negotiation that took 8 months and resulted in Harlow buying out Viviane's portion and retaining the Glebe property. He had the kitchen redone. He chose the countertops himself. He did not date for a year. This was a deliberate choice. Not punishment, not performance of grief, but the kind of considered interval that a builder would give any structure before determining whether it was ready to bear new weight. He went to the gym. He took a long weekend in Tofino, alone, and walked along the beach in November rain without checking his phone. He cooked the same 4 meals on rotation because he liked them, and they required no audience. Beecham Structural, in the 18 months following the Gala, grew by 12%. The same Lawrence Bridge Corridor project ran on schedule and under budget, a fact that appeared in an infrastructure industry newsletter and was later picked up by the Ottawa Citizen in a piece about the revival of skilled trades certification in Eastern Ontario. In the article, Harlow was quoted once briefly on the subject of why the project mattered. "These bridges have been holding things together for 100 years. They deserve to be treated like they're worth the effort." 64 families, and then 71. He met a woman named Elise at a fundraiser for a trades mentorship program. She was on the board. She was a civil engineer with the city. She had the habit of asking one very precise question and then listening completely to the answer, without appearing to formulate her response while he spoke. He noticed this on the first evening. He thought about it for 2 weeks afterward. On their third date, she asked him about the Gala. She had read the Citizen article and recognized the name. "What was that night like?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. He thought about the coat on his shoulders and the compass pin, and the stillness at the table, and Conrad's nod, and the light on the canal. "It was the first time in a long time," he said, "that I walked into a room and didn't adjust myself for anyone." Elise considered this. She had the kind of face that registered thought without concealing it. "That's a hard thing to learn," she said. "It is," he said, "but worth it." He looked at her for a moment, the careful, structural way he looked at things he was considering trusting. "Yes," he said, "worth it. Some people never understand the value of a quiet man until the room goes still and every head turns, and they realize he's the one it turned for."